Well, here we are again. I see many of the same faces we see regularly. And before I introduce the speaker, I'd like to review the remainder of the program. On the 7th of April, we'll have the president of Claremont Graduate School, Professor Louis Benezet, talking on the liberal arts, the battle for amateur standing. And that will be followed by an evening discussion. On April 14th, we'll have Professor Carl McIntosh, who's the president of Long Beach State College, with us, talking on the State College, Anyone for Teaching. On April 21st, Chancellor Murphy will be with us to discuss teaching in the university, thus giving us a kind of a view of all of the teaching institutions in the state of California and more or less what is expected of teachers at them and what the teachers actually do. Then on the 28th, we hope to have a bang-up panel discussion on the evaluation of teaching with some of the members, past and present, of the Academic Senate Committee, which deals with this. I think it's the Budget Committee. And that'll be an opportunity for some of us who would like to raise hell, I think, to do so. So we invite you to all of these, and we hope you'll invite your friends. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Pace of the Education Department, who will introduce our speaker. Dr. Pace.
Our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Wilber McKeachie, is chairman of the Psychology Department at the University of Michigan. He has spent his whole professional career at the University of Michigan. Got his PhD in the Psychology Department there about 1949, I think. And 1961 was made chairman of the department. His route to that present position is in some ways unusual. He is the kind of person who many psychology departments look for and don't always find. He is a person who has been deeply devoted to and interested in undergraduate teaching. Very soon after he became a faculty member at the University of Michigan, he was put in charge of organizing the introductory psychology course, and then later of the general undergraduate program. Well, this is the kind of thing that takes a good bit of time, and there are thousands of students to be taught. And he, however, made a real virtue and a contribution to research out of this particular assignment to undergraduate teaching. He simply organized the whole program into what in many respects was a series of psychological experiments on problems of teaching and learning, which are very relevant to the work of psychologists, so that the combination of research on teaching is one of Dr. McKeachie's special characteristics. He has written a chapter in a very large book that came out last year, sponsored by the American Educational Research Association, called A Handbook on Teaching. And he has a chapter in there on research on college and university teaching, in which he cites a great deal of the experimental literature on this particular subject. I assume he's going to talk about this, although, as you see, he is also a humanist. The title that he has given to his address this afternoon, he has taken from literature. Gladly would he learn and gladly teach. Is Chaucer's formula enough? Dr. McKeachie.
You'll recall that this line, "Gladly would he learn and gladly teach," occurs in Chaucer's prologue as he describes an Oxford cleric. And if I misquote, my friend Bob Cobb of University of Kansas English Department is here to correct me, I guess. An Oxford cleric, still a student though, one who had taken logic long, long ago, was there. His horse was thinner than a rake, and he was not too fat, I undertake, but had a hollow look, a sober stare. The thread upon his overcoat was bare. He had found no preferment in the church, and he was too unworldly to make search for secular employment. By his bed, he preferred having 20 books in red and black of Aristotle's philosophy to having fine clothes, fiddle, or psaltery. Though a philosopher, as I've told, he had not found the stone for making gold. Whatever money from his friends he took, he spent on learning or another book, and prayed for them most earnestly, returning thanks to them thus for paying for his learning. His only care was study, and indeed he never spoke a word more than was need, formal at that, respectful in the extreme, short to the point, and lofty in his theme. The thought of moral virtue filled his speech, and he would gladly learn and gladly teach. The picture of the scholar presented by Chaucer has persisted down through the ages, and I think not without reason. Professors still buy books instead of fine clothes. Our lectures today don't espouse the meek obedience of the cleric's Griselda, but scholars still follow a way of life at variance with that of the popular culture of the day. But our task is no less than to mold our culture more nearly to the model of Chaucer's cleric. And to do this, we must ourselves provide models in our own lives exemplifying the joy of learning and of teaching. Is Chaucer's formula enough? Perhaps not. But it is at the heart of the college teacher's role. And what I have to say this afternoon is more nearly an amplification than a rebuttal. If Chaucer's clerk were to speak of the university, I suspect that he would not call it a center of higher education or a degree-granting institution, but rather a center of learning, a center of higher learning. And in using this term, I'm borrowing directly from my friend Roger Hines, Vice President of Academic Affairs at the University of Michigan, and a good deal of what I have to say this afternoon is really taken from his conception of the university and ideas which I've taken over quite directly from him. Thinking of the university as a center of higher learning, we think about the university then as a place where individuals learn the best that has been discovered and where they learn more, they acquire new knowledge. The essential process is that of learning not as a noun, but learning as a participle. And the essential characteristic of all members of the community is that they are all learners. Now, what's the role of the teacher and of teaching if we have this conception of the university? This means that the teacher is an expert on the conditions of learning, the learning of his own subject matter. He's a motivator, an analyst, a critic, a setter of standards. He's interested in developing mastery of the subject matter and of its methods in his students. And every device that is useful to this end can be of aid to him. But nothing can replace him as an expert on the conditions of learning and the creative uses of these aids and of these conditions of learning. So programs, textbooks, television, lab manuals, films, these things only release him from tasks which he should never have had. Being the source of information or being the drill master of students really goes back to the Middle Ages when books were expensive and oral transmission of learning was necessary. Teaching aids replace the teacher in his least important or even his non-essential functions, and they replace most satisfactorily the least useful, the most mechanical, the least imaginative teaching. Now, this conception of teaching isn't universally held by all professors or by all students. Some years ago, we compared 3 teaching methods in our general psychology course. One of these methods was what we thought was sort of a stereotype of the worst of traditional conceptions of the role of the teacher. The teacher came in each day with a set of very specific factual questions and ran the sections. These were all sections of about 25 students. Ran the sections with questions to the students, which he very ostentatiously graded as they answered them. He didn't accept volunteers from the classroom. He simply looked at his grade book and called out a name after asking the question, then graded the student on his answer to that question. He might use a demonstration to break up the pattern somewhat. At least once a week, he had a written quiz, typically true, false, multiple choice, objective type. The whole emphasis was upon the teacher as a drill master in this section of the course. Second method was a method that we thought would give maximum opportunity for the individual learner. In this method, which we called the tutorial method, we originally intended that students shouldn't come to class at all. Unfortunately, our dean felt that some parents might object to paying tuition and not having classes, so he suggested that we ought to work out our experiment in such a way that there would still be class meetings. And so what we did was to go to class, but then to simply sit in the front of the room to be available for student questions. We also carried along a couple of big suitcases full of books of kind of supplementary readings which the students might pursue. And for the students in this group, we stressed the advantage of working at one's own pace, of delving more deeply into areas that were of particular interest, and of adapting one's learning methods to his own skills and his own needs. The third method was the one which we prized particularly. The leaders of the group tended to be social psychologists. This was in the immediate post-war era when group dynamics was the big thing, and the experiments of Kurt Lewin on face-to-face groups, group decision techniques, and so forth were the hot things for us to read about, study. And so the third method, discussion method, was one in which the teacher came in, tried to do a good deal of bringing out the group in group discussion. Instead of having very specific questions, the questions he brought to class with him tended to be broad ones, getting at the major issues in the material, of the implications of the material for general problems of life. He played the role of discussion leader and summarizer, and tried to get maximum student participation in the period. Well, the results of that experiment were a little disappointing to those of us who advocated the discussion method. It turned out that on our final examination, the students who'd been in the recitation groups did best of all. Tutorial students did worst. This wasn't so shocking since our final examination was an objective type examination, and the students in the recitation sections had been practicing this type of examination all semester long, week after week. But what really hurt us was that not only did the students do well with recitation on the objective exams, but they also loved it. They thought this was tremendous. Each of us was teaching each of these 3 sections. We were rated as being most effective as teachers in the recitation sections. The students in those sections thought psychology was great. They wanted to take more of it. This was the teaching method par excellence as far as students were concerned. Now, we think we worked out some explanations of why this should be. One of them being students' anxiety about grades and the fact that in the recitation sections they knew exactly where they stood. They were keeping up with their studying. Every week they had to take the quizzes and answer the questions. They never had the feeling that they were falling behind and that someday they'd have to catch up if they were going to pass the final examination. Everything was paced for them, highly structured for them, and this is apparently what they wanted. Well, I shouldn't leave you with a feeling. This left me with the notion that recitation methods are best. We did other studies which I think demonstrated some virtues of the discussion method after all. But the point I was trying to make here was that this reaction of the students, I think, confuses achievement of grades with achievement of the fundamental goals of higher education, and that this confusion is found among students, and I suspect found among us as teachers also. If we take Hines' conception of the teacher as an expert in learning, this means that we're going to give relatively little emphasis to the teacher as a source of information. Of course, he has to know something about his subject, or know his subject in quotes. But this conception stresses that knowledge is a concomitant of the teacher's skill as a learner and not the sine qua non of teaching. The necessity of knowing one's subject seems to me to be typically overemphasized both by teachers and by students. One of the things it does is to lead the teacher to limit his presentations only to what he knows, which means he never gets into the really exciting parts of his field. Or it may lead him into a kind of a cat and mouse game with students, in which he demonstrates his superiority with one-upmanship on certain obscure facts of the field. It can lead to confusing the difficulty of a course with the educational value of a course. And there are lots of ways to make a course difficult without making it any better as a learning experience. You can make a course difficult by giving assignments which are too long, by covering very minute details of the material, by making your presentation so obscure that the students can't grasp what it is that's important, by capricious and arbitrary testing or grading standards. There are lots of things you can do to make a course difficult which do not contribute to learning. And I think that the conception of the teacher as the source of knowledge leads to these sorts of misleading of the students from the real goals of education. It seems to me that thinking of knowledge as the basis of education is an open invitation to laziness, really. Laziness on the part of the teacher and laziness on the part of the students. Facts are really pretty easy to teach. They're certainly easier to examine upon than anything that's much more than knowledge. And thus you get a sort of a collusive relationship between teachers and students, in which the teacher presents the facts and thus doesn't have to do very much preparation or work or thinking about what he's going to do in teaching. And the students dutifully take down notes on these facts and give them back in examination. And in return for not having had to think or to explore or to question, they don't demand that the teacher give any thought to providing learning experiences which will take them beyond knowledge as an outcome of the course. So the important question is not, does the teacher know the subject, but is he an effective scholar? And can he communicate the attitudes and the skills of scholarship in his field to his students? Now, what does this mean for teachers as members of this community of learners? Well, it means that the teacher sees the student as fellow learners rather than as disciples or someone a great deal below him. It means that the teacher is, or at least is trying to become, an expert on the conditions for optimum learning and upon the proper use of the conditions of learning for the teaching he does in his field. I think that here is where psychology and educational psychology can be helpful. It's not a substitute for scholarship, and I don't think that educators have really ever thought that it was, even though they've been accused of this. But it can help the professor, the scholar, become aware of what it is that he does as he goes about learning his field. And it can help him show students how they can interiorize and take over some of these things which he has mastered for himself in his scholarly work. What this conception means is that the teacher tries to work himself out of a job. That if we look at the course of education from kindergarten through the university and graduate school, the teacher's role as a giver of rewards, as a setter of standards, as an evaluator, as a resource of knowledge, is continually going to diminish because the students are going to become more and more skilled at doing these things for themselves. And our task is to help them how to learn to do these things for themselves so that eventually they are independent of us. Well, we know something, I think, about how these things can be brought about. For example, in one experiment, which followed after the one I talked to you about earlier, we set up again group discussion classes. This time, two kinds of discussion classes. One in which the teacher was the center of all of the interaction going on in the classroom. Students participated by asking questions and answering questions. They felt very free. At the end of the course, they thought they'd been in very good discussion groups. But always the teacher was the person who was asking the questions. When a student would answer a question, he would ask another one. When a student asked a question, he would answer it or would refer it to another student, but tended to discourage interaction among the students. And the second thing that we tried to do in the experimental groups in this case was, as contrasted with this conception of the teacher's role, to make him more nearly a part of the group. And where we started out early in the semester, giving a fair amount of structure to the group and the teacher taking a good deal of responsibility for asking questions and for summarizing. We tried, as the semester wore along, to turn over more and more of these things to the group itself so that the students themselves made decisions about what the assignments should be, when the test should be. They even decided in my two classes, for example, one of them met at 8 o'clock, decided that they would have class in our Women's League building and have breakfast with class rather than have breakfast before class so they could sleep a little later. So they had a good deal of power to make decisions affecting their own fate. There's a good deal of clarity about what was going on in the course because they were making these decisions themselves and hence were a little clearer about what was going to be expected of them. And these decisions in turn were imposed by me as teacher in the other class and by the other people teaching in this particular experiment so that essentially the tests and the assignments and everything else were common to the two types of classes. The only difference being that in one case, the students themselves during the term were making more and more of the decisions which were the controlling factors in their own learning and were also imposed by the teacher on their particular control group. Well, in this case, using this kind of conception of trying to work ourselves out of a job, we found that we didn't get differences in factual learning between the two groups, but we did get differences in the students' ability to use the concepts in a meaningful way. The way we tried to measure this, and it's probably not perfect, but at least it did work for us, was to show a film and then ask the students to discuss the film. Transcripts of the discussion were then judged by experienced clinical psychologists and who didn't even know that an experiment was going on. They were simply asked to evaluate these transcripts, see if they could sort them in any way, and we found that they uniformly agreed that those from the groupie classes belonged in one group and those from the more traditional classes belonged in another group. And their comments about them were, well, this group, the control group, tend to be pretty typical introductory psychology students. They know the labels of certain forms of behavior, they know the defense mechanisms, but they apply them more or less in a kind of just counting off way, an intellectual way, without very much real understanding of the dynamics of the case presented in the film. The other groups of papers, they said these look as if they came from more advanced psychology students. These students not only know the labels of behavior, but they seem to have some real understanding and sympathy for the concepts. They can use them with real meaning. Well, this is not very strong evidence, but at least points in the direction I would like it to, and I think we have other evidence that points in the same direction, that students taught in this way of being given more responsibility for their own learning, being treated as peers rather than as inferiors, do develop a different type of learning than those who are taught in traditional student-teacher relationships. Another experiment we ran was one in which students were given a good deal of independence during the course for their own reading. The first 5 weeks of the course, they read the standard textbook. They were tested on that at the end of 5 weeks, and then the rest of the term were free to read on their own and to carry out an experiment on their own. And these were freshmen and sophomores, introductory students. We found that as compared with the students in the traditionally taught sections of the course, these students who had this, what we call tutorial method, actually they were in small groups of about 5 or 6, but they met more irregularly than regular sections. These students came out at the end of the course with no difference in factual outcomes, but they had more plans for additional reading to do. They seemed to have formulated some idea of themselves as learners. They knew the sources to go for additional information, and it looked to us, and I wish we had followed them up, that they were more likely to continue their learning after the end of the course than our students in the traditional sections. Well, the implications, I think, of this sort of conception of the teacher as an expert in learning means that the teacher needs to have an ability to organize a program of study. He needs to be able to use the resources of learning in his field, that he needs to help his students understand that not all information has to come from one source, that they can learn from other students. He has to be concerned with attitudes and values which transcend his subject matter, and skills, curiosity, motives, things which go much beyond the knowledge of his field. And he knows that what he is currently requiring in the way of coverage of content is likely to become obsolete, that his field is not a fixed one, in which what he's teaching now is something which must be remembered forever, but that he's training students to become aware of changes in the field, to keep up with it, to make progress as the field progresses. It means that the teacher is concerned with conditions of discovery, where even in the introductory course, in the most elementary matters, the student gets some experience of the delights and pleasures of independent discovery, of acquiring new skills and new knowledge. And I think all of us must cringe when we think of how often we take all the mystery out of our subject matter and emphasize the dogmatic, where we make learning as dull as ditch digging. So much for the role of the teacher. What's the role of the student? Well, in a sense, it's the reciprocal, and I think has been implied in what I've already said. The student has to develop skills of independent learning, and I think there are one or two that are particularly interesting. For example, the student's expectations and attitudes about his relationship to the teacher seem to me to be particularly important. I think most of our students come to us with an attitude of dependency upon us. There are conflicts about this derived from, we tend to get them, I suppose, after the greatest stresses of adolescence are over. But I think students still come to college with a fond belief that there's one way to learn, and that is from a teacher who meets a class Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 9 o'clock in a formal setting with seats arranged in neat rows, and with the teacher being the primary source of information, or if not the teacher, at least the teacher and the textbook. And I think we as teachers have to carefully but firmly tear down this primitive idea of the teacher's role. We have to recognize that we won't find this easy. These are long-standing habits that students bring to college. And the role that we take in this conception I've been plugging for is perhaps not as gratifying After all, this dependency of students upon us is a rather flattering thing. It has a seductive appeal to us. It's nice to have disciples and to have people hanging on your words, even if it's just because they know that these words are going to be asked for on the next test. So we have to resist manfully the efforts on the part of the student to remain dependent, to make us feel good because we're authorities. And we have to recognize that often they're going to be resentful as we begin to cut the umbilical cord. Second thing is, in the student's role, is his negative attitude toward fellow students. Most students don't perceive other students as being useful in the learning process. They tend to regard other students as competitors for the teacher's attention, for good marks. Other students are, in a sense, interferences as perceived by the typical student. And it's an indictment of our educational system, I think, that these ideas have developed and are very tenacious. Well, I'm not sure that I have the solution as to how we go about changing these attitudes. I think it involves, to some extent, the sort of assignments we make. To some extent, I think it involves creative use of groups, and this is why I think a completely individual tutorial method may not be the ideal method of teaching. To some extent, it involves positive responses ourselves to students' ideas, because if our own attitudes do not convey the notion that what different students are saying is important, we can hardly expect that our students are going to see these things as important. But I think that using our resources wisely, we can enlarge the student's view of who can help him and whom he can help as a fellow learner. Now, to develop these attitudes, we have to recognize that there are great individual differences among students. My recent research has been concerned with differences in students in such motives as need for power, need for affiliation, need for achievement. And we find that, for example, students who are high in need for affiliation do best in courses where the teacher is a warm, friendly individual who takes a personal interest in his students. These same warm, friendly teachers, by the way, are not very effective for students who are low in need for affiliation. And similarly, the student who has a high need for power tends to do best in classes where there's a good deal of opportunity for him to express his own opinions and to assert his ideas and argue for them. But this doesn't mean, I think, that we need to segregate these students and, have all our warm, friendly teachers teaching high-need AF students and our argumentative teachers teaching the high-need power students and so forth. I think, though, that it does mean that we need to be aware of individual differences in students, to recognize that even within a given class, we may need to vary our approaches to different types of students, that we have to take students at different points and to develop different skills for them, so that some students learn how to learn from the non-authoritarian teacher, and other students learn how to learn from the cold, distant teacher, or from the warm, friendly one for that matter. It's terribly important that we do our best in doing this. Our students, I think, in most colleges today are pretty serious and hardworking. Certainly, this would be true of students at Michigan and at selective institutions like the University of California system. And our traditional resources are pretty limited. I think we haven't, at the college level, scratched the surface of the potential for help that we can get from our colleagues, our fellow professors, and our fellow students. I think that there's some implications here for teaching versus research. If we emphasize that university is a center for learning, and learning as a process which has to characterize all the members of that community, then, as everyone has said, I guess, in the universities for a long time, it's really a false dichotomy to say that teaching is on one hand and research on the other. I think that they sometimes are made antithetical by a failure to develop the implications of this idea that the university is a center for learning. The students are confused about it. They're wondering if they're being shortchanged by a teacher who spends time doing research. And I think it's particularly useful for a teaching fellow to be aware of, or a teaching assistant as you call them here, to be aware of the essential compatibility of his role while working on his own prelims and dissertation and his role as a teacher. In a sense, these are not, certainly they compete for time, but unless he is a learner, he according to this conception, is not likely to be a good teacher. And so the things that the skills he's developing in learning as a graduate student are the same sort of skills which he should be exemplifying for his students as a teaching assistant. So ideally, all the members of the university community are always engaged for some part of the time at least in learning, in discovering what for them as individuals are new ideas, new facts, new laws, new principles. And a careful comparison of the essential ingredients of this process by the established scholar and the process by which his students acquire new knowledge, I think would reveal that the two processes are not very much different. So, what I'm saying is that all the people in the university, the young, the old, the regulars, the transients, are learners. The faculty member is himself a learner at some time and at different levels. And his role with respect to the student then is one of a partner in the activities of learning. Now, as a more mature learner, he has to remain sensitive to the essentials of the discipline. He has to have some perspective on what is important. He should be alert to new developments. But in his search for new facts, he inevitably has to be skeptical about the facts that are currently known. And thus I think he's more likely to avoid this trap I talked about earlier of regarding present knowledge as the end of knowledge in his field. So, this conception of the university is a rather frightening one. I think that we fall far short of its implications. The attitudes and habits of mind that I'm advocating are difficult to develop. We know very little about how to do it. What we do know is that their development is time-consuming, and this, I think, is one of the problems with highly accelerated programs. It's costly. It requires the time and the best efforts of high levels of talent. But what we know is that if we're to achieve these attributes in our young, there has to be somewhere in the daily life of the student personal, intimate contact between himself and a model. And I think this is the key. And I emphasize that personal intimate. I think that this is one of the problems of the large university. It's one we're trying to get around by setting up small residential colleges within the university. It's certainly a problem at a commuting institution. So the key is really that the abilities, the skills, and values we're trying to develop come about through contact with people who represent these skills and values in their own behavior, in their grasp of the subject, in their own habits of inquiry, in the standards they set. And we don't know precisely how this happens, but that it happens has been observed through histories. Societies have always been concerned with models, with living examples of the great commitments of life. Socrates, Jesus of Nazareth, I think are only two examples. Now, it's fortunate for those of us who teach that we know that the model doesn't have to be perfect for the characteristics to develop. But we also know, to our sorrow, that imperfections in the teacher interfere with learning. Dogmatism, overcritical teachers who tend to generate their own kind of disciples, lazy teachers who tempt students to parrot back what they've memorized. It's an expensive process to do right. And I mention this again because I think that there is a threat to the current state of the universities in financial commitments to higher education. That as more students come in and greater sums of money are required to educate them, we're going to be pressed to abandon this conception of teaching. But preserving the greatness of the universities isn't just an economic matter. It's a matter of values. And the question is whether or not we ourselves accept these values, whether we want to preserve this conception of the education process and all that it entails. My purpose has been less to review research than to remind us of what a vast and complicated place the university is, to review what I see as being the basic process that goes on here. Young and vigorous minds in close contact with devoted men and women of real power and substance, coming together in an atmosphere which is conducive to mutual growth and development of the skills that are necessary for our society. I think that this conception of learning as a mutual process is, at least for me, best exemplified by a poem by Langston Hughes, the Negro poet. It's called Theme for English B. The instructor said, "Go home and write a page tonight and let that page come out of you. Then it will be true." I wonder if it's that simple. I'm 22, colored, born in Winston-Salem. I went to school there, then Durham, then here on this college on the hill above Harlem. I'm the only colored student in my class. The steps from the hill lead down into Harlem, through a park. Then I cross St. Nicholas, 8th Avenue, 7th, and I come to the Y, the Harlem branch Y, where I take the elevator up to my room, sit down, and write this page. It's not easy to know what's true for you or me at 22, my age, but I guess I'm what I feel and see and hear. Harlem, I hear you, hear me. We too, you, me, talk on this page. I hear New York, too. Me? Who? Well, I like to eat, sleep, drink, and be in love. I like to work, read, learn, and understand life. I like a pipe for a Christmas present, or records, Bessie, Bop, or Bach. I guess being colored doesn't make me not like the same things other folks like who are other races. So will my page be colored that I write? Being me, it will not be white, but it will be a part of you, instructor. You are white, yet a part of me as I am a part of you. That's American. Sometimes perhaps you don't want to be a part of me, nor do I often want to be a part of you, but we are, and that's true. As I learn from you, I guess you learn from me, although you're older and white and somewhat more free. This is my page for English B.
Thank you, Professor McKeachie. If there are some questions, why, Professor McKeachie would be glad to answer them now.
Teach half the year and do research at half the year. Do you have to be college?
I think it probably does for some teachers. I don't know, when I've had a sabbatical or been on full-time research, I'm not sure that I really accomplished more than when I was teaching and doing research maybe a quarter time or half time. I think it's difficult to put in, I think most of us probably put in 70, 80-hour weeks probably as professors. And it's just difficult to spend that much time just on research. Now maybe it's because most of my life I've been teaching and I've sort of formed a pattern of work which combines teaching and research at the same time. So that this is what works out for me. But I have the feeling that I need a relief from research once in a while and a change of pace which teaching gives me. And so I like to be doing them at the same time, even though they do get in the way of each other sometimes.
Have you found any way of preventing the grading system from interfering with this spirit of mutual quest of learning together and non-dependency and so on?
No, I think it is a handicap sometimes. I recognize that it has values and that it's something we have to live with. One of the things I do is give a good deal of ungraded work, which the students simply turn in. I find that students seem to respond well to things that they turn in, and I just write comments on without grades. I try also to make what I am going to grade on fairly clear to them so that they're not in the dark about what it is that's going to determine their grades. I try to convince them that the grade measure is probably only a small part of what they should be learning in the course, and that I obviously can't grade them on some of the things which are really very important, like attitudes toward the field. But I don't know. It's tough.
Would you say that this type of permissive, sort of empathic type of teaching approach, I think Rogers did something like this, could be used in a secondary and primary level, at the secondary and primary level, as well as the...
Well, I think people have used it. My conception probably would be that it can't be used well. That is, I think that for effective discussion, for example, you've got to have backgrounds and knowledge and experience, which probably have to be acquired originally in more structured situations. I don't know. I just have the notion that it's kind of a gradual weaning process, pretty much like socialization as a whole, and that a complete non-directedness in the elementary grades would not be as effective. But I'm not an expert on elementary education at all, and so.
I meant really after the foundation. In other words, probably more on the secondary history classes.
I think it can be used at any level. Probably the attitudes, at least, are important. Even though you may, in one course, give a good deal of structure and direction, and in another course, relatively little, depending upon the sorts of learners you're dealing with. Yeah, I'd say that it can be used more than we probably typically do. But that's just my personal bias. I wouldn't be able to cite any evidence for it.
I don't know if this kind of research should be set up, but I'd like to see some kind of some research done comparing the European ways, but just preparing for examinations, compared to taking a certain number of courses and adding to units. Anything like that's been done.
No, European professors have the impression that there's a good deal of waste time early in the student's career. There's a good deal of attrition or lack of productivity through excessive anxiety at the time of the examination or as the examination approaches. But I don't know how it works out on the average. Most of the Europeans I've talked to feel that something kind of in between their system and ours would probably be more desirable than either. I don't think there's any evidence.
I wonder, does learning require a certain amount of fear, or is fear sort of considered?
I don't think it requires fear. I would hope that curiosity would be just as fundamental as fear. I don't think that fear necessarily does any great harm at low levels, but I think it does at the levels that many of our students have about learning. That is, I think sometimes we do develop kind of a stereotype behavior. One time we tried to teach our students about study habits. And there are, kind of rules like it's better to pace your learning, spread it out over the semester than cram, and it's better to ask yourself questions about material than to simply read, reread, and so forth. I'm not sure how valid some of these generalizations are, but these are usually what are included in how to study manuals. And we found that the students, on a question on the final examination about which of methods they should choose, they knew all the right study habits. We asked them how they studied for the exam. They all used just rereading and the things which they hadn't learned in the course. So evidently, I think that there's so much anxiety that most of us are very reluctant to give up methods that we've been using and approaches that we've been using. And it's very hard for us to change our approaches to a subject. And I think this is a result of anxiety to a large extent.
You mentioned what qualitative and different experiments, but did you do any quantitative type experiments? What comes to my mind immediately is having to take many different classes. And each class would increase the pressure of the student a bit more. Like require one class to memorize one page, next class 2 pages, the 10th class, whole chapter, per day or per week. And so find out what the maximum amount of knowledge that shut into them.
Mm-hmm. This would be interesting to do. Most of the experiments I'm doing, or most of the studies I'm doing now, are not true experiments. In the early ones, we did try to manipulate learning conditions. One of the problems is getting people to cooperate. I found that since I became chairman, I can't get people to teach the way I want them to when I want to run an experiment, even as much as I could when I was one of the teaching fellows. Then I could sort of appeal to their sense of loyalty or something. Now I can't seem to get people to agree to teach in an experimental way. There's also a problem of getting control, at least for any substantial period of time. You drill them on what you want, what the condition is, and then you find out that within a group of teachers you've got a tremendous variance, so that the overlap between what are supposed to be different methods is great, and trying to get degrees of something is virtually impossible. So that now what we typically do is to let teachers teach the way they want to, and then observe the natural variation. And last year, for example, I did try to look at something like this in terms of standards. We asked the student how high the standards were that the instructor set, and simply got their ratings on low to high to see if there were some sort of appropriate level, which, I had a hypothesis this would affect different students differing in need for achievement differently, that the student high in need for achievement would do best and like best classes where the standards were kind of moderately high. It didn't work out, so I don't know whether it was because the students weren't good observers for me, or whether my theory was wrong, or whether I need to take into account other differences in the students as well.
Have you done any experiments with the use of program learning with the process orientation towards learning? In other words, data would be a part of the program and experiencing of it would be improved.
I haven't. I think this would be an interesting thing to do, and I think is one of the real assets of programmed methods is building in certain things which you want to be able to depend upon when you get into the group situation.
What effect do you think the publish or perish policy has upon trying to foster learning and research in pathways that we need to engender this approach in this idea?
Yeah, it's sort of the same thing as studying for grades for the students. And I don't know. It worries me. I think we counter this pretty well at the departmental level. But in our system at U of M, our promotion recommendations are also screened by a college committee. You've got an even worse system here as far as I can see. But the people at the college level really can't distinguish this sort of difference in motivation. And we will screen out some people at our departmental level who we think are just publishing because they think this is going to win them points. And kind of, I think, do take into account what the guy's real attitudes toward his research are. But you get to the college level, and the guy who loves learning but isn't turning out very much is not going to get through, so that they're not able to assess these sort of qualitative things, which we do try to take into account at the departmental level. And it puts pressure on the young faculty member particularly, which I think is undesirable. Well, I don't know. It's not, I think there's a certain amount of pressure is good. I've got one staff member who probably never would publish without this sort of pressure. He's a good scholar, and I think that if he, once he gets started publishing, he'll find that he likes it. But he might never get to do it unless he had this sort of external pressure on him. So I wouldn't say that it's unqualifiedly bad, I guess.
For any more experimental structural setting in the University of Michigan classes besides psychology courses?
Yes, we've worked with French and mathematics, and well, we've collected some data in other departments, typically student rating type data. Nothing, we've never had another department actually train teachers to fill different roles. I've never had that much control over anybody else that I could persuade them to do it.
Before we take the next question, I want to make sure that you all know that this evening at 7:30, Professor McKeachie will be in Student Union 2408 for a discussion and further development of some of the ideas and notions we've heard, and perhaps a little controversy. Now that I believe you have a question.
Yeah, a couple of times you mentioned your experiments that involve the use of some sort of student observation. How in general do you evaluate the reliability of such observations?
They're very reliable. I assume you're a psychology student. No? Well, by reliability we mean that they're consistent. That is, that you ask different people and you get the same answer, essentially, or you ask people at different times, you get the same answer. And you can get very high degrees of reliability. The same teacher will tend to get rated the same way by different groups of students. Two classes, for example, rating pretty much the same. As for validity, which is probably what you're particularly interested in, they're pretty good. We've used observers, and observers tend to agree pretty well with the students. Of course, typically we haven't used observers who've been in every day, so I tend to rely, if there is disagreement, I tend to think the students are probably better informed. They've simply got more information than the observers have, but generally there's pretty good agreement between them. They're best probably when it's a non-evaluative sort of thing. Now there are just some general problems in scaling and mathematical models applied to this sort of measurement, which mean that any sort of evaluative judgment, that is he more or less effective than other teachers, is a much more complex question than does he put an outline on the board, or does he set, well, even such a thing as does he set high standards is probably more objective than is he an effective instructor. In these sort of evaluative types of judgments, you're getting into the question of where the student sees the ideal. And one student may see the ideal instructor here, another student see the ideal instructor here. The instructor may be in between here someplace. If so, he'll get moderately high ratings from both of these students. If he's over here someplace, the students whose ideals are over here are going to mark him as ineffective. The students whose ideals here will mark him more effective. And you'll get a kind of an average or below average rating. People out in extremes, in other words, will tend to get lower ratings than those who are in toward the middle of the students' ideals of what a teacher should be. When you are assessing, on the other hand, their behavior, for example, the students participate freely in the class, or Does he return tests promptly? Then what they're rating on is something which most all the students will agree upon, and thus you can get not only a higher degree of reliability, but also, I think, a higher degree of validity. And we tend to use both kinds. We have some notions about some of the characteristics we're interested in terms of objective behavior. We do find that the teachers who are rated by the students as being most effective are most effective as measured by the students' achievement, but this is a relatively low correlation. So there's some validity even on these broad judgmental things, and I think a high degree of validity on the descriptive things.
One more question before we go.
One of our earlier speakers mentioned the use of such things as small groups for discussions between instructors relatively early in their careers, where they will sometimes use paper courses at their own lectures, and some discussion among them as to how to improve their teaching. I think this would be useful more generally.
I think it would be very useful. I'm sorry we don't use it ourselves. We do have seminars for our teaching fellows where they talk about what they've done, but they don't have to admit that they've made a mistake unless they want to. And probably if you could develop the sort of atmosphere where they felt free to let themselves be looked at and to talk about it, I think you probably would get more learning.
Well, we hope to see you all this evening. Thank you very much.